What's up guys, Sagi here, and I finally have the iPad Air 4 in sky blue, which I've been so excited for. You know how sometimes you order something online, but you've never seen the product in real life, so you don't know exactly what it's gonna look like? Well, for me, this is it. So again, I'm super excited about the color and to get this thing out of the box, so let's get going. I got the 64 gigabyte Wi-Fi only model because I never really need to use my iPad somewhere where I don't have Wi-Fi, and if I ever do, I can just tether off my iPhone, which starting today will be the iPhone 12 Pro. I was first gonna get this in space gray, but then I was thinking, let's try some color, and that's why I chose the sky blue. So we don't need a knife this year. Still, never. I can never get this out of the box. Like, it's coming. All right, so the iPad's right on top, and normally I would go through what's in the box first, but I really want to see this color, so that's where we're gonna start. All right, so I gotta say, I love the way this looks. I wasn't sure how blue the blue is gonna be, but this is so thin. It's like, I love the squared off edges, and it's like just enough blue. It's like, it's a metallic blue, kind of like a pastel metallic blue, but I really like it. I like it, I'm super happy. I didn't want this iPad to be like super blue like the phones, or at least the iPhone 12 is, so I'm really happy with how this looks. All right, so let's put this to the side, look at what's in the rest of the box. Designed by Apple in California, cool. Some papers that nobody cares about. Stickers, blue stickers? No, white stickers. It'd be cool if they were blue stickers though, right? Like sky blue Apple stickers. That would have been cool. No luck. You get white stickers and you're gonna like it. Nice. USB-C to USB-C cable, because as we'll talk about in a minute, the iPad Air 4 got USB-C now instead of Lightning. Thank goodness. That's great in case you don't have one of these cables. And then we also have an adapter, which is a 20 watt adapter, unlike the 18 watt adapter that you get with the iPad Pro. So that's excellent, especially if you're coming from an older iPad, or if you only have iPhone chargers, you may not have a USB-C adapter because they're all USB-A to Lightning. So now you can use this new adapter, new cable, you're good to go. Okay, so we actually have a lot to talk about with this new iPad, from the all new design with both aesthetic and functional aspects, a new camera, upgraded connectivity, a better audio system, and new authentication functionality. So let's get started. Now first I want to talk about the design, because if you're coming from the iPad Air 3 or even an older model, that's probably the first thing that you're gonna notice. And really it's been completely redesigned. We have the flat squared off edges of the iPad Pro and the iPhone 12. Now whether you like this look or not, it does come with a functional aspect to it because of the second generation Apple Pencil, which can now snap to the side and then charge wirelessly. Now personally, I know I'm much less likely to misplace my pencil this way, and I can also charge the pencil when I'm storing or transporting the iPad without having to worry about it getting damaged. Now this new design also shrinks down the top and bottom bezels, and we no longer have a home button. Now looking at the back, we have a new 12 megapixel camera, which is an upgrade from the 8 megapixel on the iPad Air 3, but we don't see the 10 megapixel ultra wide or the LiDAR scanner that we see on the iPad Pro. On the front, we have a 7 megapixel FaceTime camera, which is similar to what we saw on the iPad Air 3. It's the same resolution as the iPad Pro, but it's not a true depth camera, so there's no facial recognition and that's why we don't have Face ID on the iPad Air 4. Instead, Apple opted for a new form of Touch ID with a fingerprint identity sensor built right into the top button. So we're getting biometric security with a one-touch activate and unlock, and we can also use this feature to make purchases or for any other functions that require authentication. Now moving on to the speaker system, we see another improvement over the iPad Air 3. We now have a 2-speaker system with 2 grills on the top and 2 on the bottom. And this system is able to provide you with a stereo soundstage when you're watching content or playing games in landscape mode. But you shouldn't confuse this with the 4-speaker system that's implemented on the iPad Pro, which really takes things to the next level because it's able to form a 3-dimensional audio experience. Now, one last thing to remember is that there is no headphone jack here. So if you do plan on using headphones, you'll need to use wireless ones or use a dongle. And next we have the USB-C port at the bottom, which again is an upgrade over the iPad Air 3. We now have much faster charging, faster data transfer, and we're able to attach more powerful accessories. And I'll cover some of those later on in the video and in future videos. And since we're discussing connectivity, we're looking at upgraded Wi-Fi 6 connectivity with faster maximum speeds than the iPad Air 3, and similar to what we're getting with the iPad Pro. Now, if you opted for the cellular model, then you'll be happy to know that you're also getting up to 60% faster LTE speeds. For Bluetooth, we're getting Bluetooth 5.0, which is great, but it's the same as what we had on the iPad 3 and the iPad Pro models. Now on the back of the device, right above the USB-C port, we see the Smart Connector, which lets you connect the iPad Air 4 to the Magic Keyboard, which now gives you a trackpad, a keyboard obviously, and a USB-C pass-through. Now moving on to the display, we're now looking at a beautiful Liquid Retina display versus the Retina display on the iPad Air 3. Now remember the smaller bezels that we talked about in the design section? That means that even though the dimensions of the iPad 4 are almost identical to the iPad Air 3, we are getting a slightly larger display at 10.9 inches and a resolution of 2360 by 1640 versus 10.5 inches and 2224 by 1668. The screen is fully laminated with a maximum brightness of 500 nits, a fingerprint resistant coating, and an anti-reflective coating. Now being fully laminated means that the image looks like it's kind of painted on the glass rather than a non-laminated display like the iPad 8, which has a visible gap between the glass and the image. Now, if you're an artist and you like to draw or sketch, a laminated display can offer a more connected visual experience. The display is a 60 Hz display, so we're not getting the same 120 Hz ProMotion display that comes with the iPad Pro. It is, however, a DCI-P3 display, which is a wider color gamut and offers a lot more variations of each color for more accurate color reproduction. Now, this is definitely a bonus for photographers and videographers who plan on doing editing, color correcting, and color grading. And the display also offers Apple's True Tone functionality, where there are actually sensors that are able to measure the color of the ambient light in your environment, and then they ensure that white always appears as white on the display. Now moving on to performance, the iPad Air 4 is extremely responsive. Apps start very quickly, and your general navigation and switching between apps also feels really snappy. Now, as you probably know, it uses the A14 Bionic chip, which is the same chip used on all 4 new models of the iPhone 12. Now, this is an extremely powerful chip, and it makes the iPad Air 4 about as capable as most users need a tablet to be. Now, are there things that the iPad Pro can do better? Yes, because of better multi-core performance and higher RAM, and that will matter to a very specific user group. And if you're interested in the differences, I'll be publishing a comparison soon. Now, one decision that you'll need to make is whether you want the 64 gig model or the 256 gig. The 64 gig model is available for $599, and the 256 is $749. And I know a lot of people were hoping that we would get a 128 model because that would sort of hit the sweet spot. And my guess is that Apple is really trying to segment the target audience with the 2 current choices. Now, a lot of this will have to do with what apps you plan on using and whether they require you to have large files available locally on the device in order to access them. So again, I feel like most people can probably get by with the 64 gig model because I think for most people, this isn't going to be the device that you take a ton of photos or videos on. I know that I take a lot more photos on my iPhone than I do on my iPads, but if you do plan on using this device for video and photos, then I definitely opt for the 256 gig model. Another reason why I would opt for the 256 is if you plan on editing a lot of photos in Lightroom or editing videos in LumaFusion, then again, go with 256 because those apps require you to have the files locally in order to actually use them. Now, speaking of photos and video, let's talk a little bit about the camera system. Now, the rear-facing camera is the same 12 megapixel wide camera that we see on the iPad Pro, but of course, there is no ultra-wide camera or LiDAR scanner. Those two missing elements do have some cool functionality for them, but it's more something that I'm excited about in my iPhone 12 Pro than on the iPad, because like I said, I'm way more likely to use my iPhone to create content. Now, the wide camera has an aperture of f1.8, or I guess rather the lens has an aperture of f1.8, and that lets in a ton of light, which will help with low light performance. So if you're in a poorly lit situation, this lens will let more light in onto the sensor. It's gonna capture more of this ambient light, and the sensor can generate an image that has less noise, or that grain that you see when you're taking pictures in the dark. And this camera also uses focus pixels for faster and more accurate focus for both photography and video. Now, speaking of video, we can film in 4K at 24, 30, and 60 frames per second. And if you're not familiar with what that means, 24 frames per second is a more cinematic look. It's what they use in films. If you look at 60 frames per second, that's gonna be more crisp and lifelike. That's what you see when you're watching the news or a soap opera, for example. And then 30 frames per second is somewhere in between. And just as a point of reference, the video you're watching right now is shot in 30 frames per second. When it comes to 4K, I'm sure you've heard the term before, but 4K is 4 times the resolution of Full HD. So instead of 1920 by 1080, we're capturing 3840 by 2160. And because we have so many more pixels, the video footage is sharper and more detailed. You can also shoot slow motion on the iPad Air 4 at 1080p at 120 frames per second and at 240 frames per second. And 240 frames per second is gonna slow things down even more. Now, moving on to the front-facing camera, or the FaceTime camera as Apple calls it, it's a 7 megapixel camera which can shoot full HD and is gonna work great for video calls. In my opinion, overall, this is as good a camera system as the majority of users are ever gonna need. And I will have a more detailed camera discussion from a photographer and videographer perspective in a separate video. Now, as far as battery life, Apple says that we should get about 10 hours of use if we're streaming video or surfing the web on Wi-Fi. And then that number drops to 9 hours if we're using cell service. Now, that's plenty for me, and I always have a power bank with me regardless. And I'll share my actual user experience with you in my 10-day review. Now, before we get to the conclusion, let's talk about the price and storage. So like I said, the iPad Air 4 comes in a 64 gig model for $599 and a 256 gig model for $749. Now, which of these models is right for you has to do with how you plan on using your iPad Air 4 and whether you mostly consume streamable content or you have a workflow that requires you to have access to large files locally. So again, if you're doing a lot of video editing, you're gonna want the 256. So is the iPad Air 4 the best choice for you, and will it give you the best performance for the money? I would say for most people, probably. You're getting a ton of features that are available on the iPad Pro 11 model for less money. The iPad Pro still has its advantages, and each user needs to choose whether those relatively few differences are worth the extra cost. Now I'd love to know what you think and whether you have any questions that I should include in my comparison. I really hope you enjoyed this unboxing and my first look at the iPad Air 4. If you did, please let me know by giving this video a thumbs up, tweet it, share it, and if you haven't yet, join the community by hitting the subscribe and notification buttons. You can always find me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Tech Gear Talk. You know what I always say? Buy it nice or buy it twice. Good luck and see you soon.